Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about agency and the role of agency in the meaning of life, an article by Bortolotti. So let us begin. So here's a particular observation about the literature on the meaning of life. A lot of people think that there's a sense of meaninglessness that comes with seeing death. Death brings to mind the limited nature of human life. And many people think in the literature that the fact that death is there, once you recognize death, you lose the sense of the value of human life, right? The finitude, the limitation of human life deprives it of its true meaning and it reveals its meaninglessness. A lot of people think that. Strangely enough, in literature, there are people that seem to argue for pretty much the opposite, not exactly the opposite, but pretty much the opposite. And those are people that think that there's something distinctively human about a relatively short life, such that if you extend life indefinitely or forever or by a large amount, something changes the human life in such a way that it no longer becomes either meaningful at all or at the very least not humanly meaningful. And in this article, the author does a good job of looking at some of the literature and isolating some of the crucial arguments. So here are some of those arguments. Again, arguments whose conclusion is that meaning in life it's deprived or undermined by extending life, especially by a long period of time. So here is one of those arguments. Claim number one: human life is essentially brief. All human lives, part of what it is to have a human life is that you die, relatively young, right? Like 100 years or less. That's not too big of a time if you compare it with, say, the size of the life of the Earth or the galaxies and things like that. So it's a tiny, tiny little fraction of time in the span of time of the universe. Yet all human lives are essentially the way. That's how human lives operate. So therefore, very long, thousands of years, millions of years, or immortal lives are not human, right? There may be angels and gods or things that are alive that live for a very, very long time, but they're not humans, right? Humans don't do that because humans are essentially the kinds of beings that have a relatively brief lifespan. So therefore, humans not enjoy eternal happiness. Perhaps gods and angels and other beings that last for a very long time can have happiness and meaning in this very long eternal sense. But like humans couldn't. Why not? Because the humans are essentially brief and eternity is not essentially brief. Therefore, there's a clash. Therefore, human beings cannot do that. Here's a different argument, slightly different argument. Human values require the certainty and proximity of death. The kinds of things we care about, like safety, security, healthcare, those kinds of things that like we fight so much about, right? Are essentially the goods that make no sense if there is no certainty and immediacy or at least proximity of death. The proximity and certainty of death is what kind of shapes or identifies the values, the things that humans value. So therefore, anything that is a value exists forever is not a human value. It's not the kind of thing that humans find valuable. So it wouldn't be a value for humans, even if those eternal values exist. Uh, but from those two things, the same thing follows. Therefore, humans cannot enjoy eternal happiness. Perhaps, say, the gods or angels can appreciate and care about values that are eternal. Good for them, right? But humans, being the kinds of things that we are, we don't. We can't, in fact, without ceasing to be humans. And here's a slightly different claim. Value requires scarcity. So this is different. The second argument says that human values require proximity of death. This one claims that value itself is the kind of thing that only makes sense in the context of scarcity. And here's one of the quotes. What is the big deal about hitting the bullseye when you have a million throws? In other words, there's something valuable and like worthy of your, satisfaction and joy when you throw the dart a few times and hey, bullseye, you're very happy. But if you throw the dart for a million throws and then it's the bullseye, like the fact that you did that for a million throws, like makes the bullseye not that impressive, not valuable. It is the scarcity of the throws that you have that make the getting the improbable bullseye valuable. Scarcity is a condition for value, is the claim. So therefore, all value requires brief lives. So this is not a claim about humanities, but a claim about value. In any case, the same conclusion follows. Humans cannot enjoy eternal happiness. There is no good that can be had that would last forever. So even if humans can live forever, they couldn't be happy forever. Their life wouldn't be meaningful forever. So those are very interesting arguments. There's a kind of underlying thread here, though there's some different claims going on. One of the beauties of this article is that he spends a lot more time talking about, okay, what is it exactly that is human life and what's valuable about human life? What is it that gives meaning to human lives? So he asks, okay, let's talk about the value of human life. So let's go kind of deeper behind these arguments and provide a credible story of meaning on the basis of the value of human life to make intelligible those arguments. So what is valuable about being a human being? That is, what is the objective element that might render human life meaningful? And here's what he says. Here's his actual proposal about value for human life. What is valuable in typical human individuals is intentional agency. Intentional agency is what is and grounds all human values, the value of human life itself. So human agency, broadly conceived as the capacity to have desires, the beliefs and preferences, and to act on them in order to achieve one's goal. So it's the capacity to be agents that have goals, that pursue those goals. And crucially, some other goods, so he continues saying these are intertwined. Other goods that we value are things like self-consciousness and the powers of autonomy and reflection, ability to think about yourself and think about who you are, take control over your life and things like that. And also the kind of rich emotional life that allows for typical humans to develop complex and rewarding interpersonal relationships, right? So love, friendship, family, things like that. We all care about that. And he's right, like that those are the things that make human life valuable. But all of those things, the emotional complex life, the autonomy, so on, they're all kind of manifestations of intentional agency. You wouldn't be able to have autonomy or reflection or engage in love relationships unless you were the kind of agent that can act intentionally, right? So it's all grounded and all springs from intentional agency, which you might think of like free autonomous agency. That's the source of what makes human life valuable, he thinks. And he has some interesting reasons to tell us about this. He doesn't just say it and assumes that we buy it. So suppose it is true that the presence of constraints in decision-making and the necessity to overcome obstacles make the achievement of human lives valuable. So he's saying that part of why intentional agency grants value is because it allows for the struggle, the enterprise, the journey towards the attainment of the goods that we care about, the goals that we care about. And those, the struggle for the ability to attain those goals, the exercise of intentional agency requires the presence of constraints and limitations and obstacles for humans to overcome and to have to make decisions. And that's where agency takes place. So anyway, suppose that is true, and that the exercise of agency is central to character development, to become who you are. So exercise of agency, intentional agency is required for who you are, for developing your personality, for attaining your goals, and the presence of constraints is a condition for the use of agency. So suppose all of that, and suppose that the public and personal conception of the self, then living longer would deprive human lives of meaning by depriving agency of its constraints. So here is a very different kind of argument. The thought is, if you think about what makes your life meaningful, it has to do with intentional agency. Intentional agency requires a lot of elements, but one of the elements is things like constraints, limitations, brevity of time, scarcity of options. That's what enables you to act in the world so you can pursue and attain your goals. So if you were to extend your life indefinitely, it would in effect remove all of those constraints. It would in effect not like remove the obstacles, because you can always keep trying. Think about, again, hitting the bullseye. You only have 20 minutes because you have to go do other things, and you start throwing the dart and you might hit the bullseye. You're very excited and there's value there. But if you have an infinite amount of time to do that in something else and something else, that there's really no constraint, no obstacle. Just keep doing it. You hit it, you move on, and you can always keep doing it. The thought is here, in that context in which there's no temporal kind of limitations or constraints, there really wouldn't be any obstacles, in which case there wouldn't really be any intentional agency. So there wouldn't really be any human value. So let's try to spell that out a little bit more. That's the main claim. Let's try to spell it out in different ways. So the value of human life is not to be found in the achievements of goals, but in the growth in character and the exercise of agency in the process of striving towards those goals. And this is central. And this is something that older people come to realize. When you're young, you think that, hey, getting the PhD is going to be the very valuable thing, or going on the date is going to be a very powerful, very valuable thing, or like getting this thing right, attaining your goals, you might think, is what makes your life valuable. But then you strive for several years, you get your PhD, you strive for this time, you get the thing you want. And then you realize, oh, that was it. Like, oh, what do I do now? Okay, well, let me do something else, right? And you move on to something else. And as you're getting older, you start looking at your past and you realize the getting of the goal was not kind of the thing that makes your life valuable and meaningful, but it was the culmination of something that did. And the thing that did make your life meaningful was the struggle, the journey, what was the trying to, the tenacity that was required for you to undergo kind of all of the acts that led to it. The struggle, the striving to attain your goals that culminated in getting it, right? If you fail, then things go different. But the striving or process of striving to attain the goals is what makes your life worth meaning. Why? Because that's an exercise of agency. You're defining yourself as you go along. You're making choices, you're struggling through life, and you kind of overcoming and growing and becoming the kind of person. It is the process of becoming, of struggling, of growing that is what makes your life worth living, not just the getting of the goal. The getting the goal is just the culmination of the process, but it's the whole process that endows your life with meaning. And some psychological studies have pointed this out. People that are super wealthy, that get things so easily, don't really seem to enjoy them. If you just get the thing you desire by clicking your fingers, you don't really, you're not happy with the thing. You don't value it, you discard it and you move on. If you struggle through it, if you work your way up to it, if you define yourself and struggling and striving towards the goal, you value it. Why? Because it has a part of yourself, as it were. Your life has been dedicated and consumed to attaining of this goal, and that's what endows your life with meaning. So happiness is not actually satisfying your desires, attaining your goals, but it's something like the self-reflective recognition of the growth that happens in the pursuit for those goals, and of course getting them too, right? If you fail things, but anyway, it's not the getting, but the struggle, is striving towards it, and the building of yourself, the exercise of intentional agency that is required in the process of growth to attain your goals. That's what makes people happy. And the psychological studies seem to indicate that too. And here's one such example. So in self-narratives are also crucial in the way in which self-integration comes together. So here's a long quote to that effect. So going back to the role of self-narratives, having overcome problems, reacted to adversities in a successful way becomes part of the individual's life story and self-conception. So these struggles become part of the way in which you understand yourself. Later events in life, which are positive, are seen by the agent and by others as the outcome of the personal transformation and the initial problems triggered. In other words, there's this kind of integration of self that defines who you are, that is the result of this constructed self-narrative of the overcoming of multiple obstacles that occur in your life. The way in which you understand yourself is through the self-narrative, and the self-narrative just is a description of the struggles that you overcame in your life trying to attain different goals. So this integration, the provided by self-narrative, of the encountering of encountering of obstacles and then the removal, so overcoming of them, and the story of the agent tells about her life. It makes it possible for the agent to approve of her many of apparent disconnected experiences in the sense of achievement, fulfillment, and purpose. So anyway, that's the last point, is that if you don't actually go through experiences of struggle in striving towards attaining goals and then encountering obstacles and overcoming them and so on, if you don't go through that struggle of exercise of agency, your life seems disconnected, fragmented, not unified, just stuff that happens to you. And the just stuff that happens to you feels alienating, feels like you're not really yourself, you feel out of control. You feel in control, empowered when you have obstacles, when you overcome them, when you exercise your agency to become a kind of person by overcoming those obstacles. And that becomes part of your self-narrative, which unifies your conception of yourself throughout your life. And all of that requires the presence of constraints, of limitations. Otherwise, there wouldn't be that kind of unification of yourself through time. You'll be lost in the chaos of reality otherwise. So here's the final way of thinking that why it is that constraints are required for agency and agency requires for human value, therefore long life would be human. So psychologists often talk about self-defining beliefs or life goals, right? The major things that define you, major desires, major goals, getting a PhD, being a university professor, being a Catholic monk, being a great painter, those kinds of life-defining things that shape the narrative and scope of your life. So psychologists talk about these things in order to focus on those beliefs that are central to one's own conception of oneself, like that they inform who you are. And those are the ones that shape the structure of your life, the shape of your life. So Sartre, the philosopher, talks about radical choices, and those radical choices give rise to, they ground those self-defining beliefs, the ones we just mentioned. And he gives an example of a soldier, or a person who may become a soldier. So there is this person, and there's an oppressive force that comes to their nation, and the invaders are the bad guys. So that's clear. There's a just war. So he has, on the one hand, the call to be patriotic and defend the victims' neighbors. He feels the call. He wants to go to war. He wants to be patriotic and defend the nation, that which is, again, a just cause. But also, he's the only son. He has a aging mother at home, and he's the only one that can really take care of her well. So he knows that if he were to respond to the call of patriotism, his mom might be left behind, might really struggle. In fact, make it even worse. So now he's there before two options, two career paths, two life choices, two radical choices. One is to join the army and become a patriot soldier, which is define him in a particular way. And the other one is to stay home and become a good mom. And the way Sartre thinks about it, there's no right answer. There is no answer before the choice. That's why the radical choices. The choices are not about which course of action is more valuable, but about what kind of person you become. They're self-defining choices. And the agent defines himself either as a good parent by staying behind and not fighting for the the cause of the nation, or by going to war and defining himself as patriotic. But those self-defining radical choices only make sense in the context of scarcity, only make sense in the context of constraints. In other words, those are the radical choices that define yourself and in the overall narrative of your life. But they only make sense in the context of scarcity. If you had an unlimited amount of time, those choices wouldn't really be pressing. You could, stay with your mom, and then after 1,000 years of being with your mom, you can go and fight wars, and you can do it all because there will be no time constraints. If your life were extended forever, the very urgency of the radical choices that make them define yourself would be taken away. The urgency will be taken away because you can do anything, because you have all the time in the world. And if you have all the time in the world and you can do anything, you wouldn't really be anything. That's the deep insight. So life goals that define you, for them to make your life meaningful, require constraint, require limitation. And agency itself requires constraints and limitation. Otherwise, you're just doing stuff, without any clear pattern, because there's no need for a pattern. The pattern itself will be undermined in the long run. Agency requires limitations. Limitation requires a short amount of period of time. And that is what makes human life meaningful. Therefore, an extended life wouldn't be meaningful or human or valuable. Okay, let's end here. See you next time.